Hello, and welcome to another episode of Room for Thought. The room I'm in today isn't in the UK, it's here in North America, and I'm here with Daniel Hannan in the room. Welcome to
Hello, Douglas.
Hello. Tell us a little bit about where we are and what we're doing here and why we've come.
We are at the top of a very steep hill in eastern Vermont, and if you were able to look out of these windows, you would see nothing around you except endless slopes of pine and spruce and birch and maple. This is the cottage built by Milton Friedman, who George Shultz described as the most influential man of the 20th century. Great free market economist. And I'm guessing that he would look out of these windows and think his great thoughts. This is where he wrote a lot of his books. The cottage is called Capitap, which I think is an unwontedly clumsy phrase.
For someone who was so articulate and such a good wordsmith, it's...
Right, capitalism and freedom. But I mean, from the guy who coined all these phrases about, society doesn't have a conscience, only people do, and this kind of stuff, unusually uneuphonic name. But it's a thought about where we are. This is wilderness. You look out of here, we're at the top of a hill, we can see in every direction, and it looks pretty much as it would have looked to the first people.
It's pretty rugged. You can see New Hampshire in the distance.
Yeah.
It's Vermont,
mountains,
green mountains everywhere.
Lakes, and forest. But go back 100 and something years, and this would have all been farmland. And you can see, we were walking around here, we could see the remnants of ruined cottages and walls and livestock pens. It's a very good example of what is nowadays called rewilding. And it happened because the country was getting richer. Basically, this was farmland, but it was poor, thin, rocky soil. As soon as the Midwest was opened for settlement, the people from here decanted.
They didn't have an agricultural subsidy to keep them here.
They were driven by self-interest, and nature poured back in. And this is one of the points that I think Milton Friedman would have enjoyed. He built this house in the earliest days of the kind of green movement, but he would have really enjoyed this point that the best thing you can do for the environment is to become rich.
We've seen quite a bit of it here, haven't we? We've seen deer and wild turkey and
right.
Even the odd chipmunk.
Right, and this is the funny thing. So you're in a wealthy country, developed country, and you have the coyotes and the wolves and so on are all coming back. That is not true in poor countries. They are still, the reforestation here is matched by continuing deforestation in countries that are still industrializing and are still cooking with open fires.
And the interesting thing is, Friedman would have appreciated this. Not only is the environment coming back and recovering, actually the farmers, we met some of them, they're doing pretty well too. They have leisure time to recreate scenes from the War of Independence.
I had thought of Vermont, and I'm sure any American viewers of yours will think of Vermont as something of a woke outlier. It is an ultra-liberal...
Bernie Sanders country.
Right. The news has been slow to reach these hills, right? Our neighbours here are fantastic people. They are kind of bearded mountain men who speak with this kind of weird Yankee accent of the kind that I've only previously heard in black and white films, and it's not even a Vermont accent. It's this peculiar East Vermont accent that sounds a little bit more like East Massachusetts. And one of the guys who was showing us how to fire flintlocks had in his family a flintlock that his ancestors had carried in the Revolutionary War on the same land.
Yeah. And Chuck has not only been living in the same plot of land for generations, he's actually got ancestors who fought against the Redskins.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We think of America as a young country, and Americans themselves very often think of their country as a young country. It's actually a very old country on almost any definition. I don't just mean in the sense that it's had a continuous regime, a continuing constitutional settlement for longer than almost anywhere else. Mm-hmm. But even as a nation, sure, Portugal is older and France is, but it's in the top 10. It's a much older country than Italy or Germany or most of the modern countries in the world, let alone in the global south. It is one of the paradoxes that Americans still think that this is an experiment. It's actually an incredibly successful demonstration of stability.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about let's discuss about our experience of shooting flintlocks. I seem to recall we had a competition.
I think I won.
There were two ranges, for the benefit of the viewers, there were two ranges of targets. Some about 20 feet away, some about 50 yards away. I don't think you shot any of the ones 50 yards away. And
I think I was going for those even further, that you in your myopic, elderly way couldn't even see where the targets were.
That's a very good way of explaining why you missed them. You weren't allowed, for the viewer's benefit, you weren't allowed to go for the distant targets until you had hit the near targets. I think you'll find, I think I've got video evidence to show this. The distant targets, I think 2 shots, and I got 2
I'll
targets.
tell you, actually, what was fascinating about that is, I mean, they were quite interesting weapons to handle. Weren't they? The weight was very different. The weight was all in the barrel, not in the stock. There was no kickback. You know, they were quite, and yet, imagine reloading when someone is shooting back at you.
In the drizzle,
right,
with all things that could go wrong.
Yeah,
I mean, a couple of the times I thought initially you had missed the target again. In fact, it had just misfired.
Yeah, there is that. The one time I think I did miss the fire was with a flintlock pistol, which actually is quite a difficult thing to hit targets with. Mm-hmm. I found it anyway. Mm-hmm.
But an extraordinary sense of history. I mean,
I just thought, how brilliant that there are these guys out in these hills with nobody around, who come out and fire 18th century firearms, which, I mean, it wasn't the actual one that had been in Chuck's family, but that they are self-consciously using sort of, Green Mountain Men weaponry. Isn't that great?
What I found striking, you've got people whose ancestors fought for their freedom, and they're very conscious of it to the point where they recreate battle scenes for people like us. And then you've got Milton Friedman's cottage, who, in a very academic, wonky way, is after the same thing, freedom.
I think this is so important. It's how many of the ancestors of Chuck would have been able to read, let alone read John Locke, and yet they'd all been infected by John Locke's ideas. And this is the power of a good idea, or indeed the power of a bad idea. Right? The same thing happened with Marxism. That it's not so much that people are directly studying the texts as primary sources. It's that they're talking to people who are talking to people who have. And so an idea infects a whole culture. And that happened in a very good way in the English-speaking world in the 18th century. I think there was a big shift towards personal freedom.
So Locke is influencing Chuck's ancestors in the 17th, 18th century. But Friedman is having that same effect today.
And so I was pondering, I hadn't heard until Bob Chichester, who's our host here and who was the editor of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series, this epical series that changed a whole generation's perceptions of markets and the role between state and citizen. I heard for the first time that George Shultz, the now he's still going, very elderly, but the brilliant patriotic Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, great economist, described Milton Friedman as the most influential man in the 20th century, and he intriguingly didn't say why he thought that. And I went away and I thought, it's an odd thing to say, because even in Schultz's era, you'd say, well, how could he be more influential than Thatcher or Reagan or indeed Deng Xiaoping, who dismantled the Maoist economic system and rescued,
what set modern China on its path.
Right, and in terms of making a practical difference in terms of human happiness, probably the most. But then, of course, Milton Friedman was writing the script for all of these guys.
Friedman obviously met Thatcher and hugely influenced her, we know that. He obviously influenced Reagan.
Who used to quote him often.
But there's this also thread of influence straight into the heart of
It's extraordinary. So he didn't actually, as far as we know, meet Deng Xiaoping. But he did have a big influence on one of the general secretaries of the Communist Party of that era, who was a great economic reformer called Zhao Ziyang. And in fact, after the atrocity in Tiananmen Square, one of the charges levelled against Zhao by the communist hardliners, and indeed used to get rid of him from his position, was that he had been working with this monstrous American free market capitalist, which was true. So you're then left with what does influence actually mean in politics, right? Who is the John Locke of today? And I think if you are the guy, so, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and even Deng Xiaoping, in a way, are the actors. And the actors are the people, of course, who get the plaudits and the fame.
They're on the silver screen. Everyone sees them.
Right. But they're only really able to operate within the parameters set by that era, within the Overton window, to use the currently voguish phrase. The guy writing the scripts for those actors could be argued to be the really influential one.
Here's an interesting point. John Locke would have influenced ordinary Americans. Chuck's ancestors would have understood these ideas. They would have been popularized through pamphleteers, through Ben Franklin, or all the rest of it. Friedman, you spoke about as influencing people at the top, the Thatchers, the Reagans, the Dengs. Is there not a danger that we see people like Friedman failing to influence the masses, the ordinary Brit, the ordinary American, the ordinary Chinese? We saw in 1980 this incredibly successful TV program, but what can we do to make sure that Friedman is better understood?
So it's a really good question. I mean, Milton Friedman was an unlikely cult figure. He was very short, very fat, very argumentative. I mean, quite good-humoured. Everyone liked him.
On screen, if you looked at him, you wouldn't have thought he was a natural representative.
Right. Bespectacled, bald, very rarely smiled. And when he did smile, it was this kind of... he had an unfortunate smile. It looked as though he was smirking at you. And yet, he had this fantastic authenticity that made him quite a cult figure. And I think that was partly because his sincerity was unmissable. It was partly because there was no hint of political correctness about him. He would say quite provocative things, quite brutally, without sparing the feelings of whom he was talking to, because he wanted them to face.
He felt he had something worth saying.
Right. But he was also, let's be honest, quite a good crafter of phrases. He would say things like a society that puts equality before prosperity, that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get both. He would say things like, governments never learn, only people learn. These are nice ways of making economics and political philosophy comprehensible, as they should be, right? Because politics is everyone's business.
And he wrote a book as part of the TV series, which became a bestseller. And the idea of an economics book being a bestseller
and selling, well over 1 million copies worldwide.
Yeah.
This was free to choose, and the TV series itself also influenced an entire generation. Now, if you watch it today, it's a bit stilted. TV was a different beast in 1980. Techniques were not what they are. There wasn't any animation. Attention spans, frankly, were probably a little bit different. And yet, for people who caught that series either on PBS here in the US or in the equivalent channels in their own countries, I think they didn't forget it. It made a lot of young people question a lot of the assumptions they had. Capitalism wasn't greedy, it wasn't about selfishness, it wasn't about the rich. Au contraire, that you had exploitation under every other system and coercion under every other system. But the market was the first one where coercion was replaced by a large degree of consensus.
So he's constantly making this moral case for the free market.
Yeah, and he would have, I think, been in a very strong position today to be reiterating his point about pro-business is not pro-market, because he would have been a huge critic of monetary policy in the run-up to the crash 10 years ago. He would have been out there saying, all the central banks are keeping interest rates too low for too long. And he would have been a fierce critic of the bailouts. Hardly anyone was. I remember you and I were. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
When the bailout was announced in the US, we were at a Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. And I think you and I were the only British politicians who, on that day, were against the bailouts. Mm-hmm. Everyone's against them now because $1 trillion went missing and no one knows where it is. And but at the time there was this sense of panic. Now he would not have panicked. He would have been a critic all the way through, and he would therefore now be in a very strong position to say, "I told you so."
But this is the interesting thing. Friedman is incredibly influential in the 80s and his ideas into the 90s and beyond. But you see on both sides of the Atlantic now a new radical left. You see AOC here in the United States, Bernie Sanders, who represents this neighbourhood around here. You see Corbyn in the UK. At the last election, he came within a few thousand votes of number 10. Why do you think we're seeing this new left?
I think that capitalism is counterintuitive. I think that the instincts and intuitions that we owe to our Stone Age DNA incline us towards tribalism and collectivism. The idea of personal freedom, although it works every time, although it makes people richer and happier every time, feels wrong. And therefore, every generation, going back at least to Rousseau, but probably further, has suffered from this sense of alienation. Yeah, okay, sure, we're living better than we ever did, but we've lost something. The world is soulless, it's materialistic, there's something unnatural. This was the feeling of alienation that was behind communism, was behind fascism, was behind the existentialists, was behind the counterculture.
Maybe the modern world feels unnatural because it is, in a sense, unnatural.
In a way it is. We've created this extraordinary miracle where we depend for our well-being on strangers who owe us nothing. But a system
we're sitting here on a
worked
mountaintop in New England drinking coffee from Rwanda, having eaten food grown thousands of miles away.
Right, and the Rwandan, the guy who harvested, or the woman who harvested the coffee beans in Rwanda, has no interest in whether we're enjoying it, has never met us, But this is the magic of the system. We've created a set of incentives where the best thing for her to do, and the best thing for you to do, and the best thing for me to do, all complement each other because we get. This is the point that every critic of capitalism, I think, misses when they say the market system is exploitative. It's bad for the poor. It allows you the powerful to grind the underprivileged. Actually, that is true of everything else. Under communism, under theocracy, under absolute monarchy, under military dictatorship, the Incas, the Aztecs, the modern African kleptocracies, medieval European kingdoms, they were all based on exploitation. And your position was determined by birth and caste and tradition. The market system is the first one that says, if you want to get ahead, or to use the lefty vocabulary, if you want to fulfill your greedy impulses, you have to do it by offering everyone else something that they want to pay for. So for the first time, your greed is harnessed to socially productive ends.
Yeah, it's also the ultimate form of internationalism. I mean, I'm still of the age where I slightly marvel when I look at my mobile phone to think that this has been assembled in China, and that the coffee I'm drinking is from the other
And
side.
actually, Milton Friedman had a nice phrase for this, where he said, the market is utterly uninterested in who you are. It doesn't care what colour you are. It doesn't care what religion you have. It doesn't care whether you're a nice person. All it cares about is, are you offering something that I want? And he had this nice phrase. He said, it's the best system ever devised to get people who hate each other to help each other, right? And in a world where people do feel this sense of atomization, anomie, whatever, shouldn't we be more interconnected? I mean, there is nothing that interconnects us better than a market system that encourages you to think of what the other guy wants. You can't be a successful, you can't function successfully in a market-based system without a measure of empathy, because you need to imagine what your customer or the person you're providing services to is interested in.
Around the world, not just here in the United States, but particularly in France and Germany, but also in China, you are starting to see a much more sort of protectionist approach. We've had 30, 40 years, largely because of the influence, I think, of Milton Friedman, a default setting amongst politicians that they needed to open up their economies. Globalization was the way forward. You had the collapse of the Soviet bloc, China then opening up in the 1990s, 100 million additional workers joining the world economy, this huge boost in living standards in the West and in China and Asia as a result of it. But now you're starting to see people
push back. Yeah, it's really, not everywhere. So there is still, I think, a default pro-trade setting in Chile, in Peru, in
Vietnam,
New Zealand, Vietnam, right? In fact, generally around the Pacific Rim, where I think a lot of the action is going to be.
There's an irony of communist Vietnam liberalizing.
I think there's a really interesting thing that has just happened in a wider geopolitical sense, which is that just as the 18th century saw a shift in the focus of world trade and world political power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, so this century has seen a shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which is going to accelerate as the 21st century progresses. And I think that's happening within countries too. I think there is a shift in population and wealth from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast of Canada, of the US, and so on. New Zealand and Australia are breaking every record for how long you can go without a negative, without a recession, or without even, in New Zealand's case, a negative quarter. Amazing growth rates in Chile, in Singapore, and so on. So just en passant, I think that's a place where we as a country need to be. And I'm delighted that I think we are now committed to applying for the CPTPP, as it's now called, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A lot of people think that doesn't make sense geographically. And of course, it's true that we're not literally a Pacific nation, except in the technical sense. Well, we are actually technically, because we own the Pitcairn Islands,
but also,
which is pretty much bang in the middle.
The camera on which we're recording this is made.
That's the point.
Nation.
Exactly. And this I think is a point that is often missed and is now, I think, deliberately missed because of the Brexit debate and because of the way people have started with their...
You can only buy cameras from EU countries.
Geography doesn't matter as much as it used to.
Yeah.
Even if you say it still matters, and of course it's easier to go and do a pitch for business in Germany than in Melbourne, but it matters much less than it did before we had the internet, before we had jet travel, before we had container ships. And as geographical proximity matters less, cultural proximity comes to matter more. And Britain has exceptionally close links to a number of the countries that are on the Pacific Rim, obviously Australia and New Zealand, obviously the US and Canada, but also, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore.
So after we've left the EU, we could have equal access to, on trade terms, to Pacific countries that Australia would have.
Yes. I mean, personally, I think as a first step, we should join the TPP, which is something that the Malaysian government wants, the Japanese government, obviously also, where we're being invited by everybody. Mm-hmm. But I think we could go much further. Among the more ambitious trading countries like New Zealand, Singapore, I think we could replicate the kind of deal that they have between Australia and New Zealand, which is just total mutual recognition for goods and services and professional qualifications.
It's legal to buy and sell something in Melbourne, and it's legal to become an accountant in Melbourne. Yeah. You can do the same in...
So that is broadly what the Australian and New Zealand governments have worked towards, starting in the early 80s, and the trick is that they've reversed the burden of proof. So there is an assumption of legality, even as you say for professional credentials. You can go a Kiwi school.
I mean, I think that's a really important one, actually.
Of course, in an age when resources are a dwindling part of the economy and human capital is a growing part, that's the biggie.
But also, a lot of protectionism in the UK is the aristocracy of labour. Yeah. Regulations to prevent people practising a particular craft or profession. Something, I forget the statistics, but a frighteningly large percentage of jobs you need some sort of permit for.
Yes.
So I think the great liberalisation that would actually help ordinary middle-class Brits would be this sort of mutual standard recognition with Australia and New Zealand.
And ultimately, I hope the US, which also has that. I mean, you need 2 years to qualify as a hairdresser in California. I mean,
it could also drive down the costs of higher education, because if you could become a qualified accountant in Canada more cheaply than in the UK,
yes,
you can suddenly see what
you get. That's it. You get competition. You get jurisdictional competition, which does not mean a lowering of standards, because why does anyone want a bad accountant? Right? What it means is a lowering of costs and actually an increase in standards, because once people can hire from more reputable places, the places that don't have that good reputation have to up their...
Like the coffee I'm drinking, I get the highest quality at the lowest cost.
Exactly. It's extraordinary how people refuse to see this, even though I'm always struck by how the Corbynistas talk about Singapore in particular as a sort of Dickensian sweatshop economy. Corbyn always talks about it as a bargain basement economy. Well, first of all, I don't know what's wrong with bargain basements. I mean, I'm quite in favour of getting stuff.
Poundland is my favourite shop.
I mean, it's a bizarre prejudice he has against people who want value. But But actually, it's just not true. I mean, wages there are higher, life expectancy is greater, health outcomes are better, educational outcomes are better, public transport is better. It turns out that if you have a high-skilled, deregulated, open economy without these guild protections and without tariffs, guess what? It raises the standard of living for everybody. So you end up being a high-skilled and high-wage economy. I just don't get how people can have this objection to it.
I suspect one of the changes from Friedman's day, when we're talking about free trade, is in Friedman's day, in order to have free trade, you basically had to have the US in favour. The Chinese economy in 1980, compared to the US economy, was
the size of the Hong Kong economy then, yeah.
Exactly. The Soviets didn't count. Most of the rest of the world, apart from a few European countries, were also rats. I wonder today even if the United States, and heaven forbid a Corbynista Britain, was to become anti-free trade, there are now enough Singapores, enough Vietnam.
I've heard you say that before, and I think I'm a little bit less optimistic than you are.
That's just generally your disposition, I think.
Yeah, maybe. It may just be my grumpy old man side. Yeah. I mean, I was in Singapore quite recently and talking to them about exactly this. And one of a very senior politician there, who would be well known to any Singaporean viewers, said, look, a country like ours, or a city-state like ours, is made possible in a world of free trade and open sea lanes. But a world where China and the US were telling people that they had to pick a side and started inserting clauses into their trade deal saying you may not trade on the following terms with the other is disastrous for a country like ours.
That's really interesting because, of course, the Asian miracle after the Second World War started in 4 states: Hong Kong, South Korea,
Taiwan.
Singapore, Taiwan. And all 4 of them were in some sense under the Anglo or Anglo-American umbrella. And all of them benefited from the injection of capital from the United States in particular. And you could argue that as other countries joined those initial 4, it's because the larger ones acquired a similar status of a sort of a world order underpinned by America.
Yeah. No, I mean, we shouldn't. Of course, the world is no longer quite as unipolar as it was 30 years ago. However, the US is still pretty much a quarter of global GDP. And, the Anglosphere is a third of world GDP. And so a change of direction in the English-speaking democracies, I think, would be hugely significant for the other 2/3 of the world, just given the realities of where wealth is concentrated. I do worry about the rhetoric in the US. I worry about the way in which people who should know better, conservatives who absolutely get why free trade works and why it delivers for the little guy and why it helps the poorest people the most, are out of cowardice or tribalism or some weird kind of polarization, pretending to go along with what on one level they know to be nonsense, which is Trump's trade policy. And I think they disgrace themselves and their party because the system depends on people showing the courage of their convictions.
Friedman presumably would say, politicians, opinion polls, they come and go. Republican candidates come and go. Democrat candidates come and go. Stick to your principles.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why people don't stick to their principles on trade is because it's a bit like what we were saying earlier about how you have to win this argument every generation because it's counterintuitive, because it feels wrong on a genetic level. The assertions made by the Trumpies, you can't carry on with a trade deficit, we can't compete with slave wage economies, we need to grow our own food, we need to protect our strategic industries. All of these things seem plausible. They all accord with our Pleistocene era intuitions. They are all wrong, and they all, if pursued, lead a country to poverty, as they will lead this one to poverty if they're not challenged. There's nothing inevitable about the prosperity of the United States. It's a result of wise policy decisions, and if those policy decisions are reversed, the economy will go in a different direction. And really, everyone knows this. I mean, about the only issue that unites every economist of left and right is that following free trade benefits the country doing it more than anybody else. I mean, it has incidental benefits for the rest of the world as well. And yet they are all, one way or another, allowing Donald Trump to get away with this. We just had lunch yesterday with the wonderful Doug Irwin at Dartmouth College, which is, I mean, I would say to anyone reading who doesn't believe me about free trade, who says, oh, yeah, but it only works if it's reciprocated, or it doesn't, what if the other guy doesn't, what if you're dealing with the Chinese and they say, read Doug Irwin's Free Trade Under Fire. It is the most brilliant, comprehensible, short defense, which the layman, you don't need to be any kind of economist, I'm not any kind of economist, but anyone can follow the argument. And it's indisputable.
I want to you mentioned a book there, I want to slightly spring this on you. There's another book that I spotted you reading on the plane on the way over. And it's a slightly depressing book because it may explain why perhaps domestic support amongst Middle America for what's essentially a liberal, in the British use the word, a liberal order, is under threat. And it's called
White Shift.
White Shift.
By a London professor called Eric Kaufman, although he's actually a Vancouverite by upbringing. And it's a long, serious book full of statistics. He walks you through the data very convincingly. He's setting out to explain. Well, it's not his sole purpose, but among other things, he is incidentally seeking to explain the authoritarian backlash in the US and parts of Europe.
What some people would characterise as populism.
Yes. And he says, is it because of the financial crash? And he shows pretty convincingly that the key driver is demographic change. And in particular, the way in which white voters start thinking of themselves as white, rather than just thinking of themselves as Swedes or Americans or whatever.
Is this because of identity politics?
Yeah, I mean, identity politics has played a very big part in this. This peculiar, the peculiar double standard of what he calls left modernism, what Kaufman calls left modernism, where ethnic diversity and identity is to be celebrated by minority groups, but deprecated and scorned in majority groups. That became unsustainable, and unfortunately, instead of the reaction being a civic liberal one that says we are all individuals, we should
Martin Luther King vision.
Right. And what would have been a basic assumption up until the late 60s of the mainstream left and the mainstream right, that, we should all be treated the same, we shouldn't ask to be treated differently. That, instead of that being the response, a constant emphasis on you are defined by being a white man, you may not intend it, but you are an oppressor class, you're born with all these things, you have this inherited. Eventually, a chunk of the population will begin to respond by thinking of themselves in a tribal sense as white voters, and they'll begin to express their political preferences accordingly. And I think that is, at least in the short term, in a multi-ethnic republic like this one, and indeed in a country like Britain where there is a large measure of ethnic diversity, I think that is an absolutely backward and dangerous development.
It's also really badly suited to the emerging condition of the United States. I mean, we were in a university town yesterday. I saw a family that looked to me like they were half probably Anglo-Celtic American and half possibly Korean Chinese American.
Yeah.
And I saw the children about the same age as my daughter, and I thought to myself, do you know what? All this debate they're having in America over ethnic quotas is going to look utterly ridiculous when you've got Americans who don't fit into any of these boxes.
And actually, that is Kaufman's cheerful conclusion. He argues that actually white people are largely going to disappear in the sense that there will be a lot of intermarriage and, 100 years from now, people are not going to look like the portraits from the 18th century. And he then asks the question, will people, when that has happened, will these new populations still think of themselves as Western people? And his answer, I haven't quite finished the book yet, but so far his answer seems to be a cautious and qualified yes. And he has a lot of...
But the Roman Republic towards the late stages would have looked and felt and sounded probably very, very different from the young Republic.
Yeah.
And yet they would have identified as being the heirs to a unique tradition.
Or indeed, I mean, look at when we were going through, as it were, in real time, the 100th anniversary of the Great War. It was very striking that the British Army in 1918 looked a lot more like the Britain of 2018 than the Britain of 1918, and I don't think that struck anyone at the time. If anyone at the time was triggered or offended by that, they kept very quiet. I don't think anyone found it odd then. So we sometimes think that this is a completely new and unprecedented situation for us. 100 years ago, the vast majority of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. I mean, this is not a new situation for us.
We live in a world where there are some people like Chuck who would have lived for many generations in a particular area. They'll be drinking coffee from Rwanda. I mean, this is globalization. You can't reverse it, and you don't want to reverse it.
Why would you want to reverse it? I mean, all globalization is the removal of barriers. All it says is that if you want to buy Rwandan coffee, no one should come between you and the supplier and forbid you from it. No one's forcing you to do it.
George III tried to come between the supplier for a less good beverage.
I don't think that's quite right, actually. The Boston Tea Party was triggered by a lowering of the duty on
really?
tea. Yeah. The British government at the time was applying the Laffer curve avant la lettre. And this was very bad news for the smugglers, of course. And that was the trigger for the 1773.
So they were protesting against market liberalisation?
Yes. Yes, it's one of the dirty secrets of that whole episode.
They kept that one quiet.
They've kept it quiet to this day. Yes, the British government basically had withdrawn most of the objectionable tariffs, kept one or two to maintain the principle that Parliament could tax, lowered it to a level where they could actually collect it because it was no longer punitive, and of course that provoked it. But I mean, but it is worth making this point about consent and voluntarism. When people say we're going to be forced to eat chlorinated chicken and hormone treatment, what means the inspector's going to stand there saying, "Come on, finish your chicken"? I mean, all that free trade argues is that you should lift barriers and allow people to make the choices that they want rather than telling them what to do.
This is the ridiculous argument against protectionism. All the debate about Britain allowing American-approved food produce into our food chain.
Yeah.
At no point when I've been over here have I hesitated about eating...
And not as anybody, right? I mean, this is what's so appalling is when you see, people who should know better, sort of Nick Clegg type people who, he lives in California.
Does he ban his family from eating American
There's no
food?
evidence that he bans his family from eating while they're in California, and yet he will go out and say, "Oh, well, I don't think people will like it," if they're told that they must say, "Oh, come on."
It's a bit like Facebook. You don't like it, don't you?
Yeah, but people are not idiots, and the vast majority, I mean, most British people have at some point been here. They know people here. They have family in the US, so they know that this is rubbish. And voters don't respond well to being treated like fools.
Fantastic. It's been wonderful having this fireside chat with you. Slightly better studio than the one we normally use. And
isn't it great to have a literal fireside chat?
Yeah.
I think the viewers will conclude that my fires are a bit better than yours.
They're a little bit like the flintlock. I was a better marksman than you, and I think you had difficulty getting the fire going, and I had to...
You actually had your fire go out until I rescued it.
I'm going to edit this so it becomes abundantly clear as to who's telling the truth there.